Hey guys, welcome back. This is the continuation of color and light. Just real quick, this week we're going to go over lighting basics like key light, fill light, shadows, reflected light, and ambient occlusion. I'm going to touch a little bit on the relationships of color, specifically how different color light sources affect local color of objects. And just the idea that certain colors under certain lighting circumstances react strongly or weakly. So let's get going. So I got this little demo set up. Bear with me. This is kind of basic, but you know, it bears mentioning. So I'll also go over a couple of little tips or process things that I use in Photoshop a lot. First of all, let's just real quick. I'm not going to use any fancy brushes or anything. Most of the time, you'll see me using like an airbrush. Fancy brush strokes aren't really what we're concerned about with this part. It's not to say don't pursue that later on, but for this class, you're just worried, just worry about color and light. Don't worry about making it look super awesome brushstroke style. That'll come later. It's just you want to understand the principles that are going to be happening. So let's. I've made a selection on a new layer. I've got a whole bunch of layers because I got something set up for you, but. This new layer selection, oops, I filled it with the wrong color. Nope. Let's fill it with like a medium gray. So we got that filled. Now, if I want to draw or paint on this layer some more, let's use a color that's a little more easily identifiable. Let's say, I want to paint along this edge to get like a nice, for whatever reason, it's a red shadow. See how I'm going outside of the edges? That could pretty much drive me nuts if I had to just worry about it. So one way I could do that is I could have kept my selection there, like this, and that would have been fine. But an easy way to do this is if you go up to this right underneath the layers and the normal and opacity, there's that other bar that says lock. If you click on this first one, it's kind of like a little checkerboard. You click on that, and what that does is it locks the transparency, so any brushstroke I make now only stays within what I've already painted on that layer before I hit lock transparency. So if I want to, extend this shape out farther, I turned off lock transparency. Now I'm going to turn it back on, and now I can only paint within that shape. So it's a pretty, I would say, extremely useful tool. I use it all the time. Another tool, in addition to that, so say you're not sure about how you want to paint on this sphere right here, and you don't want to have to keep erasing and going back, and even if maybe you want to layer an effect. So what I do is, either it's locked or it's not, doesn't matter for this purpose, so we'll leave it locked, but I create a new layer. Now if you hold down Alt, which would be the same key for the color picker, see how the color picker shows up? You hold down Alt and you'll see, the hand shows up as you hover over the layer. But if you go between the layer you just created and the layer with the circle, see how it changes to that little kind of like circle thing, kind of looks like a lock, but it's not supposed to be. If you click on in between those two, you'll see that the thumbnail moves slightly over, and you'll see this little arrow pointing down. That means this layer is using the layer beneath it, the circle layer, as a transparency guide. So it's kind of like what we did with locking the transparency up here, except now we have a whole another layer. And so I can say, well, I like that line there. Maybe I want to do another line here, but I'm not sure. So we'll turn that off, turn it on. Maybe I like it. It works, whatever. So those are two of the many ways that you can kind of easily confine painting to a shape, so you don't have to keep worrying about the edges. Okay, so you'll see me use a lot of that, and I'll call it out periodically, but just wanted to throw that out there. It's, again, I can't stress how useful this tool becomes. I mean, even if you're doing quicker paintings that are looser, maybe sometimes you want to work in a specific area without having to worry about the edges. It's a really handy tool. So that being said, let's jump to lighting. So the first thing up we have is, well, this is basically what you would see with no light. It's dark. There's light is basically how we see things. Light comes from whatever the light source is, hits an object and bounces back to our eyes, and we're able to, in a lot of cases, we're able to differentiate color, but that's basically how it works. Light moves from the light source, hits an object, reflects back. You're going to hear me use an analogy about tennis balls a lot, and light pretty much acts like you're throwing a ball against a surface, but we'll get into that in a second. So with no light, we have a completely dark scene. Let's add a light. Let's say that there's a floor plane on here. If we add a light, we kind of get something like that, Well, but this class is about color and light, and it'd be pretty boring if we painted just a floor. So what I've done is I made a layer and I made a sphere, much like I did earlier with the selection tool, and I filled it with gray. You see over here this little lock? It's because I locked the transparency. So you want to make sure that you push down on the lock transparency button, and this little lock shows up. So now, if I paint on this layer, which I'm actually not going to do, but I'll do it for demonstration, it stays within the ball. That way, we don't have to worry, we don't have to worry about keeping in the edges. We're just worried about the effect of light and not so much the drawing. Okay? So, we got this ball here, and we have a light that's affecting the ground, but it's not really affecting this ball. So, what do we call this light? Well, in most cases, we call this the key light, or the main light source. Okay? What happens with the key light? Well, usually it's the most intense light in the scene. That's why it's the key. It's the light that basically dominates the scene. What happens in this area, or what happens because of the key light? Well, one of the things that can happen is a highlight can happen, which would happen the point closest to the light source. So let's just say that our light source is kind of coming in this general direction. Maybe it's a little pointing back in space a little, so away from us. So what's it going to do? Well, we've been alive for a while, so we kind of know what's going to happen. We have a rough estimate. So the side closest, right here, it's going to get a little lighter, right? Because we got the light source here. If this was a shiny material, you might get a little bit of a highlight there. Again, the highlight will happen closest, the point closest to the light, highest point capturing the light. So this is actually a reflection of the light source. Okay. What else is going to happen? Well, we're going to get what's called a form shadow. Should probably move this over just a wee bit. Well, we'll just pretend that it's kind of in the same area. So a form shadow. Well, what's a form shadow? By definition, the form shadow is the form turning away from the light. So you're going to kind of get just this, at least on a sphere, you're going to get this nice gradation from it's in the light, the form is turning away from the light, so it's getting slightly darker until it's all the way out of the light and you're in shadow, hence the form shadow. Okay? We kind of got this sphere, and it's looking like a sphere now because we have the light side, the highlight, and the shadow. So the sphere is reacting to the light, and this ground plane is reacting to the light, but there's no interaction between the two. It's almost as if the sphere isn't actually in the scene, or it's not touching the ground. So we can fix that really quick just by putting in a drop shadow, or a cast shadow. Been using Photoshop way too long. A cast shadow is basically a shadow cast by one form onto another. So I did this earlier, and it kind of sticks to the ideas of a cast shadow. I mean, it may not be perfect, but we're just saying that the light, as the light rays pass, it can't reach this surface. If we only had one light source, this would basically be our setup. But you're looking at it and you might think something is slightly wrong, and you would be correct. One thing we're missing, even with a single light source, would be a bounce light source. So remember how I said I was going to pull up an analogy of a tennis ball? We can kind of go into it like this. So if you have a tennis ball and you throw it against the ground, you throw it once and the ball is going to hit the ground, and it's going to bounce pretty high. It might bounce higher than your hand was when you threw it because you threw it pretty hard. So it's going to bounce pretty high. The second time it bounces, it won't bounce quite as high. And basically what's happening is every time the ball is making contact with the ground is absorbing some of the energy from that ball. And so the bounce, or the energy in the ball that's making it bounce, is becoming less and less. So that's basically what's happening with light. So light is coming in, and it's hitting the surface, the ball bouncing out this way and that way. It's also hitting the ground, and some of the rays bounce up into the ball, bounce back to the ground and up, and they kind of ricochet in there. And every time it's bouncing, it's losing a little bit more energy, so the light is becoming a little less intense. So we call that bounce light because the light is bouncing around, but it's also called reflected light because light is being reflected off of a surface. It's bouncing, but it's really being reflected. So we need to add a little bit of bounce to the bottom of this. Actually, now that I see it next to the dark shadow, that feels a little better. And I'm just gonna kind of color pick the ground. Just paint a little bit right there. Lower the intensity, or lower the opacity, sorry. Probably have to lower just a little more. So we have our light source, our highlight, our shadow, and a little bit of bounce. I think that might be a little intense, but the more intense your light source, the more intense the bounce. So we could say this, this light source is the strongest light source in the room, but it's may not be, insanely bright like a halogen bulb or something where, it's basically like throwing the light rays even harder so that they bounce around a lot more because there's just more energy. Usually the most intense causes the highlight, causes the form shadow. Form shadow being light diminishing as the form turns away from the light source. And also, whoops, it's not up there, but also causes the cast shadow. The shadow cast by one form over another. And it also causes, or usually causes, bounce light or reflected light. So that's one light source. Most of the time, you could have one light source for dramatic effect, but most of the time, you're going to have a second light source, and that's usually called a fill light. A fill light or an ambient light source is a secondary light source, usually less intense than the key light. An example of this is if you go outside on a sunny day. If we could think of the sun as the key light and the sky as our fill, the sky is actually giving off light, so the shadow side of the building is actually the side that the key light is not affecting. The sun's not affecting the shadow side, but the fill light is. And this brings up a really important point. When you have multiple light sources in a scene, the absence of one light source usually means the presence of another. Okay? So wherever the sun is not hitting, the skylight is probably filling that up, unless it's blocked from the light source or from the sky in some fashion. Okay? Just kind of taking that a little further, when the sun casts a shadow, the skylight fills the shadow with a less intense light. Because the light is less intense, the shadow, or the fill light, is less bright. This also goes for bounce light, since it might be occupying an area created by the form shadow. This is why in order to have believable light interacting with objects, we kind of need to understand what the light is doing and how it's affecting the environment. A simple way to think about this is if you're in a room with two people and one of them's yelling and the other one is whispering, the whole time that the person yelling is yelling, you're not going to be able to hear the person whispering. But in those instances when the person yelling pauses, you might hear that person whispering. So light is kind of the same thing. The sunlight would be the louder of the two, and the skylight would be the quieter of the two. So the fill light. Again, usually less intense, and like we were talking about, fills most areas, not occupied by the key light. So let's add some fill light into this. You'll notice that I'm constantly, I'll do that again. I created a new layer and I'm holding down that same key, which brings up the color picker, Alt, and I'm hovering in between the layer I just created and the layer beneath it, and it's parenting to that first sphere layer that I had. See it there? Again, start building up the lights. So kind of a good rule of thumb is most of what's in the shadow side is not going to compete value-wise with what's in the light side. It really can't unless the fill light is another key, which in this case it's not. Just think of it as things in the shadow side will never be quite as bright as the light side. Sometimes they may come close in some instances, but general rule of thumb, it's the shadow side will always be darker. So we're just going to pick a slightly lighter color there. So yeah, there we go. We got a little bit of fill light hitting the object, but the fill light is also hitting the cast shadow. It's going to be filling up the cast shadow, much like on a sunny day when that blue skylight is filling up the shadows cast by the sun. So I'm going to go down to this layer down here that is my my cast shadow, and I'm going to add a layer above it, and I'm going to hold down Alt again. Can't tell you how much I use this. hover in between the two and click, and so the thumbnail's moved over a little and you see the little arrow going down. And I'm going to use the same color and kind of paint in to this area. Maybe not that bright. That's kind of okay. So we just inadvertently kind of created something that we'll want to make note of, and that is we just created a core shadow. With the two light sources, there's actually a slightly darker band right here, and that's what's called the core shadow, and that's where the fill light and the key light aren't quite reaching this area. Okay, so it can be one of the darker areas, possibly not the darkest, but one of the darker areas, or in a color, like a color scheme or a color version, one of the more intense colors. Okay, so we got our light side, we got our fill light, affecting both it's going into the form shadow caused by the key light, and it's also going into the cast shadow caused by the key light. Something kind of doesn't look right, and that brings us to one of the last parts of this demo, which is ambient occlusion, or the contact shadow. So we're gonna kind of zoom in quite a bit. Probably should have done this earlier, but most of the times when I'm painting, I stay zoomed out, or I try to. So ambient occlusion, there are certain areas that are so much out of either light source that by the time light eventually gets them, if it actually does, it's been bouncing around so much that it's so weak it's almost gone. Some people call this the contact shadow. A good way to illustrate this is if you put your hand on a surface that's not emitting light, like a table, you'll notice like a dark area right where your hand meets the table, and it quickly fades out from that point of contact. And that's just the light rays bouncing around and not really kind of being able to get back into that little crevice. Going back to the tennis ball idea, if you throw a ball at a wall in a little room, this might be helpful if I illustrate this, but say you got this little room, and like maybe a little box or something, and you throw a ball and it hits off of this, and then it hits off of that, and it hits off of this, and then bounces back. It's going to keep ricocheting, but you'll notice that unless you throw it directly at the corner, it won't hit the corner. So a clearer illustration of this is, let's zoom in like 1,000%. If we throw the ball, and most of the balls are being thrown directly at this point, they're all just bouncing right off, and they're kind of, unless you hit that corner directly, they're missing this area. So this area right here is going to be darker. I mean, that's a really extreme case of it, but I've noticed that actually really helps to sell. If you play it up, even exaggerate quite a bit, it really helps to sell a painting being a little more real. And I guess it's just that we've been conditioned after so much, 3D renders and whatnot, to kind of look for that. I mean, again, it could easily become a gimmick, so don't do it too much, or don't exaggerate it too much. So I'm going back in, this is my cast shadow layer. I'm going to add a new layer, holding down Alt in between, and it's parented to that, so I have two layers parented to the shadow, or the cast shadow layer. And I'm just going to pick like a black, because it's basically an extreme absence of light. We're just going to kind of add it in there. And yeah, that's looking a bit better. And we could just add same thing for the sphere. Same thing with a little black, and it's going to fade off pretty quick on the sphere. But I think that that gets there. That does the job of selling it. If we zoom in, we can see the painting and all that stuff. But if we zoom out, it looks fairly believable. I mean, yeah, we have played it up just a little bit, but slide it around just a little to see if I can get a little better, because my painting's not that good. Yeah, so that right there is ambient occlusion and contact shadow. Again, this small, seemingly innocuous thing, it plays a really big role, and I think in combination with all the others, all the other elements, fill light and key light, core shadow, it's one of those pieces of the puzzle that if it's not there, you kind of get the idea of what's happening in the picture, but having all the pieces of the puzzle there is better than not having them all. I know that was super deep, but and so what I've done is I've done a couple of other just quick versions, and pull those up right now. This is kind of like an ambient light setup, and this is a weak light source, not really too intense. That you'll notice that the ground is slightly lighter than the wall back here. Soft shadows because the light is diffused. There's no real strong direction to it. It's just kind of a hazy, if I just do a little drawing, it's kind of, the light is coming in at all different kinds of angles, and maybe it's being scattered through something, like maybe it's a cloudy day, or maybe there's a screen on top of this, but it's not all coming in at one specific angle. This is I just did this real quick to kind of show two key lights, and this probably isn't too accurate, but if you go out on like a sports field or something with a bunch of different lights, you'll notice that shadows being cast in different directions. So this would kind of be the scenario if you had one major light source here and another major light source here. And the last one, remember when we talked about high key? This is kind of that idea where the light is super intense, so you don't get a lot of dark colors. You might get just a little, but even then I think that's a bit much. So those are just some different lighting scenarios where light is affecting the elements slightly differently. You don't see too strong of a core shadow in this one because this light is just so overpowering that it's actually becoming its own fill light. Whereas in this one, the core shadow is kind of like a ring right here because the fill light is maybe coming from off screen over here. And this is just basically all fill. So having covered basically just the basic lighting and cast shadow, highlights, all that good stuff, let's move a little bit into color. Usually your light sources, key and fill, will have a touch of color. Again, if you go outside, the sun, the key light is slightly yellow, and the sky, the fill light is slightly blue, usually. There's endless variation to the day. People will usually refer to light in terms of temperature, either warm or cool. This is because colors are usually grouped into warm or cool colors. or warm or cool groups. This is just basic. It may not be the most accurate color wheel because I made this, but if you go online, you can just type in color wheel and you'll get a pretty accurate representation. You'll see that for the most part, colors are kind of divided up in the warm and the cool. Yellow, orange, 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 red, 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 violet. I could have added in, there's orange, red, and then there's red, orange, and then there's red, and then there's, red, violet, violet, red. But this is just kind of like a simplification. If you want to add two warm colors together, kind of makes sense that they stay warm. And when you add two cool colors together, makes sense that they stay cool. But when you kind of mix the two, so green and red, you get something that's neither warm or cool. It's just like putting ice cubes in coffee. You get something, it's neutral. It's not hot and it's not cold. It's kind of just in the middle. And that's what we call a neutral, which fits into like the realm of grays. Usually you'll rarely have a pure just neutral. You'll have colors that are so weak in chroma that they might seem gray, especially next to a more saturated color, but they're actually a very desaturated color from this color wheel. Again, just to point out, this color wheel doesn't deal with value. This is just dealing purely with chroma. If we look at a warm light source like the sun, depending on the time of day, you might see a more yellow light. Because the light is warm, warmer colors will seem more intense, like the reds, yellows, and the oranges. So cooler colors will seem less cool because they are being reflected back to our eyes with warm light. So that warm color is being mixed in with the cool. Blues, violets, and greens might seem like warmer versions of themselves because they all have a little bit of that yellow mixed in, at least in this scenario with the sun giving off a yellow light. On the other hand, if we took a cool light source like the sky, we'd see the opposite. Cooler colors like blue and violet and green become more intense, and they would typically, with a cooler light source, they would typically lean in this region right here, probably the cooler region of the color wheel. Warmer colors like red, orange, and yellow would feel weaker or less intense and come off as cooler versions of themselves. One way to think about this is if your light source is warm, it has less of an ability to reflect cool colors to your eye. Cooler colors will appear less intense and warmer because you can't actually see those colors as well under those lighting circumstances. It's important to figure out the temperature of your light source so that you can believably suggest color. Again, I know it sounds really simple, but warm plus a warm equals another warm. May not be as warm as it was before, but it's still within the warm range. It's still on this side of the color wheel. Cool plus a cool will still be somewhat cool. It never really crosses the threshold of warm to cool. But a cool plus a warm, again, you're kind of canceling each other out, and that's when you get a neutral. Okay? A less intense version of a color.
So now I'm gonna just do two quick demos. The first one is going to be a warm light exercise, and then the second one will be a cool light exercise. One thing to keep in mind, by comparison, if you have a warm light, your shadows are going to be cool. If you have a cool light, your shadows are going to be warm. So just think of it light and dark, warm and cool, or cool and warm. What I mean by light and dark is they're going to be opposites. So if you have a warm light, cool shadow, cool light, warm shadow. It's just a good principle to kind of keep in mind. Sometimes I'm going to play it up here a little bit, but sometimes that difference is very subtle, but it's noticeable. So here, just doing kind of same steps we did on the black and white study, the lighting study. I kind of know where I want my key light, so I'm just working in the form shadow. Again, where the form is turning away from the light. And yeah, I had pre-made my cast shadows because I just didn't want to mess around with that. So the cast shadow being the shadow cast by the form or by one object onto another object by the key light. Now I'm just going to quickly just put in a little key light. So this is going to be a warm light. And this is just, again, for me to kind of remember the general direction. May not be perfect, but that's okay. So I'm doing the same process where I add a layer and then I parent it to a layer beneath. Right now what I'm doing is I'm adding the light to the ground plane. What I did was I picked the neutral gray, the local color of the ground plane, and you see a little bit of lag. And what I did was in the color picker, I tried to think in terms of, okay, what's happening to this color? It's getting lighter, and then it's getting warmer. And because it's a neutral gray, it easily picks up the color of that key light. So I just kind of moved it more towards basically in the family of yellow, orange. And so now I'm painting in the light affecting the surface of the red sphere. Again, I picked the local color of the red sphere, and then I moved it lighter and warmer. I mean, that's basically what's happening. You have a light source, so the light is making your object brighter. So you wanna increase or lighten the value, and depending on the light source, whether it's warm or cool, it has to do that it has to either warm or cool the surface or the local color. So you'll see me struggle a bit with the blue because I'm basically crossing that threshold of warm to cool. I mean, technically I'm not crossing it, but it is a warm blue. And so if that sounds confusing, mixing it or trying to get the right color to say that is just as difficult. Yeah, for whatever reason, I have a lot of trouble trying to find this color, and you'll see me erase it a couple times. And what I'm trying to think of is, okay, if I have a yellow light, what is going to happen to that blue color when it comes back to my eye? I know that there's not a lot of blue in a yellow light. So when it bounces back to my eye, there is less blue in those, that reflection. So I'm trying to take out the blue, add in the yellow, and it's just not working. I think what I end up doing is I just kind of take out the blue. I'm adding orange, which is a complement, and so I'm neutralizing the blue. And I think I'm okay with this for now. Going into the adding the fill light. And so because I have a warm key light, my shadows are going to be cool. And so what I'm doing is I'm playing that up. I'm making the fill light slightly blue. And I'm going to try and see how that blue affects the surface. So you see I color picked the red in the shadow. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm moving it lighter and cooler. And I'm going to test it out, and I don't think that works too well, so moving it even cooler and less saturated. And I think I might let that go for now. So what's going to happen to the blue? Well, it's not going to be as light as the, see I just erased it. It's not going to be as light as the light side, but it's definitely going to be cooler. So these are two things that I'm juggling to try and get the right color in there. And you'll notice we got that that little spot where the fill light and the key light don't cross, and we have little core shadows happening there. So now I'm just filling the cast shadows from the key light with the fill light, filling with the fill. I mean, yeah, just go outside on a sunny day and you'll see how that skylight, that blue skylight, is filling up the cast shadows from the sun. It's I mean, it's all about kind of making observations from life and then trying to bring them back and uh, kind of explain your point, or use those observations to further your illustration. And working on some bounce light, because that warm light is so intense, it's going to bounce a lot more than the cool light. So just trying to get the right intensity of that light coming up. And you'll notice I just color picked the ground because I think at this point the temperature shift is somewhat negligible, meaning you might not see it too much, but for the purposes of this demo, it's, I think it works just fine. So yep, I keep zooming out, and zooming out is just kind of like an easy way to kind of take in the whole image and see if the light is working in a believable fashion. And I think, there's always, room that you could improve. I could probably lighten the cast shadows slightly, but for right now, I think they're okay. Right now, I'm trying to, I'm second guessing that color that I have on the blue sphere. So yeah, and I just canceled it. I think that works. It's a very desaturated blue, and it's warmer than it used to be. Yeah. Again, these sometimes, you pick a color and it's going to be hard, and you just kind of rely on, what is going to happen with the color and from observations from life. So now I'm just going to do a cool variation of this. I'm going to get rid of all the layers that pertain to the warm lighting scheme. That was all the layers of warm light on the spheres and the cool fill light. Getting rid of that, and got rid of the fill light in the cast shadows. And now I'm just color shifting. Went into hue saturation, and I'm just shifting the color around for the light source hitting the ground plane. And I'm gonna change that little light icon. I'm gonna change the color of it in just a second. Yeah, there we go. I was about to start painting and then realized, hey, I got to change that light source because I'm going to get confused. You don't have to put the light source in your homework, but I just put it in there to kind of let you know where the light source is, and to also, kind of remind myself. I may not stick to it 100%, but it's at least it gives me a point of reference. So here I am. I'm adding a little bit of lit side to the blue sphere, and I don't know why, but red is an easier color for me to move around. And you'll see that what I did was the cool light is hitting the surface of the red sphere, and it just there's no that red color is losing so much intensity because there's just not a lot of red in the wavelengths of that light. So you really desaturate it and bring the intensity way down. It's still warm in comparison to the light side of the blue sphere, but as far as the shadow side of the red sphere, it's pretty cool. Um, Again, cool light, warm shadow. Um, and let's see, right now I'm gonna putting in the fill light, or at least hinting at it. And again, I'm playing this up. This is a pretty desaturated orange, but when it's next to a blue, it feels pretty warm. So I'm gonna fill in the cast shadows. Again, going back to that principle of the absence of one light source is the presence of another, for the most part, except where those tiny little crevices, like the contact shadow, where light just can't bounce around and can't really get to. So, yeah, I mean, if you look at the shadows compared to the light, they're pretty warm on their own. As just if you color pick that and put it on a little a file right next to it, it may not seem like a really warm color, but by comparison in this image, it's pretty warm. And so that's kind of what you want to go for. By comparison, your shadows are going to be warmer in this scenario than your light side. So cool light, warm shadow. I know it sounds like a broken record, but you really want to, understand that by comparison, your shadows are going to lean towards the opposite temperature than your key light. And see how I just pulled that blue all the way. I basically took out all the blue, just really kind of trying to take down that intensity of that color, and now I'm starting to warm it up. I'm also thinking about the value and trying to keep it low, because I don't want, that fill light's not as intense as the key, so I don't want it to be brighter. I want it to stay fairly dark back there. Yeah, you see me keep zooming out, and again, that's just to kind of see if the lighting is working together, and it doesn't have to look photoreal, but it just has to. I guess the rule of thumb is if it looks wrong, if you can, looking at a thumbnail or looking at it zoomed out, if it looks really weird, then you got to go back in and fix something. But if you kind of just look at it and you say, yep, that works, then you're good. Yeah, just adding in that bounce light. Again, I don't think it's doing too much to the local color. Even if it is, for this demo, it's not really too noticeable. You zoom out to that point, and you need just that hint of a slightly lighter value, and that it's slightly cool. And by color picking the ground plane, which is already cool, I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone there. Yeah, just looking at it, and I think that's it. So I'm just gonna really quick kind of go through and explain how to set up your image. I've gotten a layer and I filled it with 50% gray, and you see me go over and I'm clicking the gradient tool, and I want the foreground color to transparent, and I click that first gradient. It's linear, and I'm just holding down shift while I drag that. I didn't like that, so I go to about 2/3 of the way down, or a third of the way down to 2/3, and just click and drag. Just do it so you get a gradient that kind of reaches the first third of the image. You can transform it after that. I did that on another layer, and you want to keep this as flexible as possible, and get rid of some of those other layers that I had. And so creating a new layer, going up to the elliptical marquee, and I'm holding down shift, and I know it's a little tough to see, but shift and I drag, and that makes a perfect circle. So now I'm going back to the gradient tool, switching back to the paint bucket, and I'm going to fill it with red. For your homework, you're going to do 3 spheres, red, blue, and yellow. I'm dragging that off to the side. I did that by holding down Command using a Mac. You can also just click that arrow that I just clicked at the top of the toolbar. I duplicated the layer, and by holding Shift, I can move it perfectly horizontal. So I duplicated that layer again, Shift, pull it to the side, and here's our three spheres, or three circles. And I just kind of did something which was Command E, but if you go up to the Layers tab, there's that Merge Layers. Now, if you lock transparency, you notice that the transparency turns off when you merge those layers. So I might turn it on right now, or I might forget about it. But you want to turn it back on. I will eventually. What I'm doing right now is I'm actually making I'm taking just a simple round brush, creating a new layer, and this is where my cast shadow is going to be. So it's easiest if you keep these things all on separate layers, just for this demo. And what I did was I changed the other dynamics, and I changed opacity to just flow, and I turned that to pen pressure, and I turned the opacity off. And so now I'm just I flatten the brush, and this is just to kind of get like a ballpark of where that cast shadow is, and then transform it either Control T or on Windows, I think, and then Apple T on or Command T on a Mac. Yeah, I'm just trying to. I'm going to do the same thing where I duplicate this, so I'm kind of messing with it a little just to, try and get it into the right, looking right, I guess. Yeah, ellipses are tough, even when you're cheating. And I think that's getting pretty close. I want to have it line up a little better with the light. I mean, you don't have to be this dead on, but well, I mean, this isn't that dead on anyways. But again, duplicated that layer and dragging it over, holding Shift. Yeah, there I go again, holding the Move tool, sliding it over with Shift, trying to line them up all in the same place. Now you'll see that one of them kind of goes off, merging those layers. I'm locking the transparency on both the cast shadows and the object. And made a little mistake there, but I control click those two layers, and now I'm just moving them so that the cast shadow doesn't go out of the picture frame. Just in case, in case you're pretty new to Photoshop, just kind of explaining. I mean, these are things that you'll use all the time in digital painting. So now with the transparency of that layer locked, of the sphere layer, I picked like a blue, and it should be the colors that you pick should be fully saturated. So just pick a color and make sure that the color picker circle is all the way up in the right hand corner, but you want something close to red, blue, and yellow. So, and we're going to use just plain old airbrush, circling the fact that I got my flow on my brush to 50%. And so you're just gonna, I created a new layer and parented it to the sphere layer, and now we're painting in the form shadow. So your homework, 3 images. One of them is this basic setup. Another one is warm light, cool shadow, and then the other one is cool light and warm shadow. So I know it was a lot to take in, but if you need to watch the video again, I mean, really, this is just kind of like this is a thing that takes a while to kind of wrap your head around. So don't get frustrated. If you need to pull up images of certain objects in lighting situations, if you need to use Google, Flickr, whatever, I prefer you not color pick, but as long as you're starting to understand what's happening with the light, um, I'm super stoked. So 3 images, one this neutral light with no fill, and then warm key, cool fill, and cool key, warm fill, each image with a red, blue, and yellow sphere. All right, see you next time.